She woke up before the sun had even thought about rising. The room was small, just a single bed with a thin blanket, small wooden table, and a cracked window that rattled whenever the wind blew. Her alarm had been set for 3 in the morning, not that she needed it. Years of waking up before the world had taught her body to rise on its own. She got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her younger brother, who was still sleeping on the floor, his head resting on a folded blanket. He had stayed home from school again, sick with a fever that she could barely tend to properly. Money was always short, and taking a day off from work was not an option. She had learned long ago that survival demanded endurance. Even when it hurt, she pulled on her uniform, faded from countless washes, and tied her hair back in a simple braid. There was no time for makeup or styling. She looked in the mirror and saw the face of someone who carried invisible scars of struggle, slight dark circles under her eyes, hands calloused from both work and worry, but a quiet determination that refused to break. She had been a nurse for years, working in a busy city hospital, often handling cases that would frighten others. She had seen illness, pain, and death, and yet she had also seen hope and recovery. Her heart carried both grief and joy, and somehow it had kept her alive and moving forward. The streets outside were already beginning to hum with life. Vendors opened their stalls, bicycles rattled over uneven pavements, and the air smelled faintly of bread, spices, and the distant exhaust of early morning traffic. She walked quickly, her shoes worn but sturdy, carrying a small bag with her lunch, a notebook, and a few personal items she could not leave behind. Today was supposed to be an ordinary day like many others, filled with rounds, patient care, and paperwork. But the universe seemed to have other plans for her. Her hospital was old but respected. She knew every corner, every sound, every emergency drill by heart. She greeted the night staff with quiet nods and the day staff with tired smiles. Her routine was mechanical, yet comforting in its predictability. It gave her a sense of control in a life that often seemed chaotic. Today, however, she was asked to step in at a charity event being held in a grand hall downtown. It was a medical camp for families who could not afford proper treatment. She was to help with checking vitals, organizing patient files, and assisting wherever she was needed. It was not unusual for her to be sent to such places, but as she approached the hall, a sense of unease started to settle in her chest. The hall was magnificent, almost blinding in its grandeur. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting sparkling reflections on the polished wooden floors. Rows of chairs stretched endlessly, filled with people dressed in their best attire, some whispering excitedly to each other. A large stage sat at the front with a shiny grand piano as its centerpiece. Banners announced a music competition for young performers, promising prizes, recognition, and the chance to perform on bigger stages. Her heart skipped a beat. She had grown up loving the piano, fingers dancing over the keys in secret after long nights of study and work. Music had been her refuge, a place where she could breathe when life became suffocating. But she had never played in front of anyone, certainly not in a hall like this. She was immediately swept into her duties. She checked patients, organized forms, and guided families to different sections. Her hands were steady, her voice calm and reassuring, but her eyes kept drifting toward the stage. The piano seemed to call to her, and she felt a tug deep in her chest. She had imagined this moment countless times in her mind, what it would feel like to sit at a piano in front of an audience, but she never imagined it would be today, or in this way. Then it happened. A frantic volunteer rushed up to her, mistaking her for one of the participants. There had been a last-minute cancellation in the competition, and they needed someone to take the empty spot immediately. She tried to explain that she was just a nurse there to help, but the volunteer insisted. There was no time for hesitation. "You can do this," they said, pointing toward the stage. "Please, we need someone." Her stomach tightened. Every nerve in her body screamed that this was impossible. She had never performed publicly, never competed, never faced a room full of strangers waiting for perfection. And yet there was a strange pull in her chest, a whisper from a dream she had kept secret for so long. She hesitated only for a moment before nodding, almost involuntarily, as she walked toward the stage. Whispers and curious eyes followed her every step. The audience had noticed the nurse in her plain uniform. the worn shoes and the tired look that spoke of a life far removed from concert halls. Some people chuckled quietly, others shook their heads, clearly thinking she was out of place. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, but she forced herself to breathe. She reminded herself of every late night she had spent learning music in secret, every stolen moment of practice when no one was watching. This was not the end, she told herself. It was just another step, another challenge. She climbed the stage slowly, her hands trembling slightly. The piano looked enormous, almost intimidating in its elegance. She sat down, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on her shoulders. The judges, their eyes sharp and expectant, watched her every move. She could feel the audience's curiosity, some smirking, some doubtful, all waiting for the inevitable failure they assumed would come. But she took a deep breath and reminded herself that music was her ally, her voice, her secret friend. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. She felt like the whole world had stopped. Memories of her life flashed before her eyes, the long hours at the hospital, the nights of exhaustion, the days of scarcity, and the moments of quiet joy when she had played music alone. She thought of her brother, his small hands clutching hers as a child. His laughter when she pretended to play for an imaginary audience. And then she let her fingers fall. The first note echoed through the hall, small and tentative, like a whisper. She felt the weight of the room, the scrutiny, but she did not falter. She played slowly, deliberately, each note a reflection of her life pain. Hope, resilience, and a quiet strength that no one could take away. As she played, her confidence grew. The music seemed to lift her, to carry her beyond the walls, beyond the judgmental eyes, into a world where only the sound mattered. Some in the audience began to shift in their seats, drawn in despite themselves. The judges leaned forward, listening closely. The sound was not perfect, not polished like a professional performer's, but it was honest, raw, and full of emotion. The nurse closed her eyes, letting the music flow through her, telling her story without words. Every chord carried her struggles, every melody her dreams, every pause her determination. Time seemed to blur. Minutes felt like hours, yet when she opened her eyes, she saw something she did not expect. Faces that had once been skeptical now softened, some wet with tears, some smiling in awe. The hall was silent, not from disapproval, but from being captivated. The nurse felt a warmth in her chest, a strange mix of relief and exhilaration. She realized that the world, for a brief moment, was listening to her, not judging her. When the last note lingered and faded, there was a long pause. Then, slowly, applause began, gentle at first, then growing louder, stronger, more insistent. The nurse sat there, chest heaving, overwhelmed by the unexpected response. She had faced the piano test, not as a competition, but as a chance to be herself, to let her music speak. And the world for once had listened. She stepped down from the stage, her hands still shaking, but a lightness in her step she had not felt in years. People began to approach her, some with congratulations, others with questions about her story. She realized that she had crossed an invisible barrier. The nurse who had walked into the hall unnoticed was now someone whose presence mattered, whose voice through music had reached the hearts of strangers. As she returned to her duties, she carried with her a quiet pride. She knew this was only the beginning. Life would continue to challenge her, throw obstacles in her path, and test her endurance. But she also knew that she had discovered something powerful within herself. The piano was no longer just an escape. It was a bridge between her world and the world of others. A simple nurse, a tired body, and yet a soul capable of touching hearts beyond imagination. And in that moment, as she helped the families at the medical camp, guiding them with gentle words and caring hands, she felt a new sense of purpose. The music had not changed her circumstances, but it had changed her. It had reminded her that no matter how small or overlooked she might feel, she had a voice, a talent, and a story worth sharing. The piano test, unexpected and daunting, had become a turning point of quiet, profound moment of recognition, not just by the audience, but by herself. The applause had faded, but the feeling it left lingered like a warm glow in her chest. She returned to her duties, guiding families through the camp with gentle care, answering questions about their children's health, checking their records, and offering what little comfort she could. Yet her mind kept drifting back to the piano, to the notes that had flowed from her fingers, and to the faces in the audience that had softened with surprise and admiration. She had expected judgment, mockery, even indifference, but instead, she had felt recognition and acknowledgement of something. Deeper, something that words could not capture. As the day continued, she noticed subtle changes around her. Volunteers who had been rushed and distracted now paused to smile at her, some offering small compliments on her performance. One young woman, a music student, whispered, "I can't believe you just played like that. It was unbelievable." The nurse felt a rush of warmth but quickly looked away, not used to receiving praise. She was not seeking attention or glory. Her life had never afforded her that luxury. But the acknowledgement, even quiet and fleeting, stirred something fragile yet powerful within her. Later, during a short break, she sat alone on a bench outside the hall. The cold air brushing against her face, she closed her eyes, letting her mind wander. The piano was not just an instrument to her. It was a voice, a friend that had stayed with her through the hardest times. She remembered nights when her small apartment was silent. The world outside seemed too heavy. She would sit at the borrowed keyboard she had saved for over a year to practice in secret. Those nights had been filled with tears, with hope, with dreams that had seemed impossible. And now, those private moments had spilled into reality, witnessed by strangers who had felt her story through music. But the reality of her life soon intruded. She had bills to pay, a brother who depended on her, patience waiting, and the constant strain of exhaustion pressing against her body and mind. Music could not change those circumstances overnight, but it could give her courage, and courage was a rare and precious thing in her world. She resolved quietly that she would carry this feeling with her, using it to navigate the challenges that awaited as the afternoon sun climbed higher. The nurse noticed a group of people gathering near the stage. Some were students, others were local reporters covering the charity event. A judge approached her, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He introduced himself and said, "Your performance earlier. It was unlike anything we expected. There is something very raw, very real in the way you play. We would like to invite you to participate in a small recital next month. There is no pressure, just a chance to play for a smaller audience. I understand if you are busy with work, but I wanted to offer the opportunity." Her heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. The idea of performing again, of stepping into the spotlight once more, was both thrilling and terrifying. She shook her head slowly, unsure of how to respond. I don't know," she said softly. "I am just a nurse. I play for myself, for my own peace. I'm not a professional. I'm not sure I belong in a recital." The judge smiled gently. "You don't have to be a professional. Music isn't about titles or status. It's about connection, and you have that in abundance. Please consider it." She nodded, a mixture of gratitude and apprehension swirling in her chest. She returned to her work, trying to focus on her responsibilities. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the piano, to the stage, and to the audience's faces, the faces of people who had, for the first time, truly seen her as the day wore on. The crowd began to thin. Families left with their forms and prescriptions, volunteers packed up supplies, and the hall started to quiet down. The nurse finally found a moment to breathe. She wandered toward the stage, fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood of the piano. The memory of the music she had played earlier came flooding back. She could almost hear the notes echoing in her mind, each one a reflection of her life, her struggles, her hopes. She sat down, just for a moment, and let her hands rest on the keys. No one was watching now, and she felt a strange sense of freedom. She played softly, almost tentatively, letting the music flow without expectation or judgment. It was different from before, less performance, more confession. Each chord carried her fatigue, each melody carried her dreams. Each pause carried her longing for a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Her mind wandered back to her brother, who had always been her quiet companion in life. He had never understood her love for music, but he had never stopped her from pursuing it either. She remembered the nights he had slept while she practiced. His small form curled up on the floor, trusting her to keep the world at bay. Music had always been their shared secret, a silent bond between them. Now, as she played, she felt that bond more strongly than ever. A reminder of why she persevered, why she worked so hard, and why she dared to dream. The quiet of the empty hall allowed her to reflect on her life in ways she rarely could. She thought of her patience, of the lives she had touched, and of the countless moments when she had felt invisible, overlooked, or undervalued. And yet here she was, having touched the hearts of strangers with nothing but a piano and her own honesty. She realized that her worth was not measured by wealth, status, or recognition. It was measured by the courage to be herself, to share her gifts, and to persist even when the world seemed indifferent. As she played, she noticed the hall's acoustics highlighting each note, each nuance of her touch. The sound was fuller than she had imagined, resonating in a way that made the space feel alive. She allowed herself to get lost in the music, her worries and doubts melting into the melodies. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of belonging, not just in the hall, not just with the audience, but within herself. She realized that music had always been her voice. Now it had become a bridge to the outside world. Hours passed without her noticing. Eventually, the volunteers returned to check on her, gently reminding her that it was time to leave. She stood, her muscles stiff from sitting so long, and took one last look at the piano. She felt gratitude, reverence, and a renewed sense of purpose. This instrument, this moment, had reminded her that even in the midst of struggle, beauty and connection were possible. As she walked back toward the small apartment she called home, the city streets now bathed in the soft glow of evening lights, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Life had not changed. Her bills were still unpaid. Her brother still needed care, and work awaited tomorrow, but something fundamental had shifted within her. She had discovered a strength she did not know she possessed, a voice that demanded to be heard, and a courage that would not let her turn away from her dreams. The following days were filled with routine, as life always was, but with a subtle difference. When she walked through the hospital halls, her movements felt lighter, her interactions warmer, and her heart more open. Patients sensed her calm, and colleagues noticed a quiet confidence in her demeanor. She was still a nurse, still responsible for tending to others. But now she carried an invisible spark, a reminder that she had faced something extraordinary and survived with her dignity and spirit intact. At night, she would sometimes return to her piano, even if only for a few minutes. She played softly, letting the music remind her of the day she had been seen, of the applause that had been genuine, and of the potential that lay dormant within her. Each session, no matter how brief, strengthened her resolve. She began to imagine herself performing again, perhaps in a small recital, perhaps in front of more people, perhaps even sharing her music with those who had never believed in her. Her brother noticed the change too. He saw her smiling more often, heard her humming quietly as she went about her tasks, and sensed a newfound peace in her presence. One evening he asked, "Are you still going to play that piano thing?" She smiled softly, ruffling his hair. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, "but I do know I can't stop playing. It's part of who I am." Word of her performance slowly began to spread, not through social media or headlines, but through whispers and personal stories. Volunteers, patients, and even a few staff members from the event spoke of the nurse who had surprised everyone, who had turned an ordinary charity event into something unforgettable. Some were inspired to pursue their own hidden passions. Others were moved to acknowledge the quiet talents of people they often overlooked. Her story became a subtle ripple, touching lives in ways she could not have anticipated. One evening, as she sat by her window, looking out at the city lights twinkling like scattered stars, she allowed herself to reflect deeply. Life had been hard, often cruel, and full of obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But the piano, the music, and the brief recognition she had received reminded her that beauty could emerge even in the darkest places. That courage could exist quietly in ordinary people. And that hope was not an abstract concept, but a lived experience. She made a silent promise to herself that night. She would continue to work, continue to care for others, but she would not let her music remain hidden. She would practice. She would explore. She would take the chances that came her way, however small, however daunting. Because for the first time, she realized that her talent, her story, and her voice mattered. And no matter how poor, tired, or overlooked she might feel, she had something precious that no one could take away: the courage to be herself, and the power to share her soul with the world through music. Days passed, but the memory of the performance in the grand hall stayed with her, haunting her in the quietest moments. She returned to the hospital, to the early mornings and late nights, to the patients who depended on her, but something had shifted inside her. That fleeting recognition, the gentle applause, and the way that the audience had listened so intently, it left a mark that no exhaustion or routine could erase. She felt as though a door had opened, one she had not dared to even imagine existed. And now she had to decide whether to walk through it. The offer from the judge lingered in her mind. He had asked her to participate in a small recital next month. It was a low-pressure event, he said, just a chance to play for a smaller audience. But the thought terrified her. She was a nurse, not a performer. Her hands were used to caring for the sick, not to dancing over piano keys in front of strangers. And yet, every time she thought of saying no, her fingers itched for the piano, her heart ached for the music, and her mind whispered that she could do more than just survive. She could shine, even if only a little. One evening, after finishing her shift, she returned to her small apartment. Her brother was asleep, curled up under the thin blanket, and the city outside glowed with soft, distant lights. She sat by the window, staring at the dark sky and trying to summon courage. She thought of all the moments she had pushed herself through, all the nights she had stayed awake to care for others, all the small sacrifices she had made to keep life moving. And she realized that fear had always been part of her journey, but so had courage. She had faced pain and hardship countless times, and she had survived. This was just another challenge, and maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to show the world what she was made of. The next morning, she decided to visit the music hall again. She needed to feel the space, to remind herself that the piano was not an enemy, but a friend. She walked slowly through the streets, feeling the weight of her uniform and the responsibilities she carried. When she arrived at the hall, it was empty, silent, and waiting. She approached the piano, running her hands lightly over the polished wood. She sat down, letting her fingers hover above the keys. For a moment she hesitated, the fear rising like a wave, threatening to pull her under. But she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the music flow. The first notes were shaky, as they often were when she practiced after long hours of work. But gradually, the music became steady, deliberate, full of emotion. Each note carried a part of her story, the exhaustion, the hope, the dreams she had kept hidden for years. She played slowly at first, then faster, letting the melody rise and fall, telling a story that no words could capture. The hall seemed to listen, its empty walls echoing back her courage, encouraging her to continue. As she played, she thought about the audience she would face at the recital. She imagined the faces, some skeptical, some supportive, some indifferent. She realized that she could not control their reactions, but she could control her own performance, her own dedication, and her own honesty. Music, she remembered, was not about perfection. It was about connection, about sharing a piece of oneself with others. And for the first time, she truly believed that she had something worth sharing. The days leading up to the recital were a delicate balance. She worked long shifts at the hospital, caring for patients, managing emergencies, and handling the endless paperwork that never seemed to end. But at night, she practiced. She played softly in the small apartment, letting the music soothe her, strengthen her. and remind her why she had fallen in love with it in the first place. Each evening, her confidence grew, her fingers became more agile, and her mind became sharper. She realized that preparation was not just about technique, it was about mental readiness, about trusting herself, and about believing that she could rise to the occasion. Finally, the day of the recital arrived. She wore her nurse uniform, simple and unadorned, feeling a strange mix of pride and vulnerability. She was not a professional performer, but she was herself, and that was enough. She arrived at the hall early, the same grand space where she had played before, now filled with chairs, small decorations, and a few hundred people quietly chatting, unaware of who she was. Volunteers guided her to a dressing area, but she barely noticed them. Her focus was on the stage, the piano, and the challenge ahead. When it was time for her to perform, she walked slowly toward the stage. She could feel the eyes of the audience upon her, some curious, some skeptical, some supportive. The judge, who had invited her, nodded encouragingly, and she gave him a small, nervous smile. She sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and let her hands rest on the keys. For a moment the hall was silent, and she could hear the faint rustle of clothing, the soft breathing of the audience, and the distant hum of the city outside. Then she began to play. The first notes were tentative, but as she continued, the music gained strength. She played not for recognition, not for applause, but for herself. For the years she had spent dreaming in secret, for the nights she had endured, for the love she carried in her heart. The melody rose and fell, full of emotion and life, telling a story of struggle, hope, and quiet triumph. The audience listened, captivated by the honesty and depth of her performance. Some faces softened. Others leaned forward, and a few closed their eyes, feeling the music in a way that transcended words. The nurse felt a strange sense of liberation, as though she were shedding layers of fear, doubt, and insecurity. She was no longer just a nurse. No longer just a tired woman from a small apartment. She was a musician, a storyteller, and a human being reaching out to others through sound. As the performance continued, she noticed subtle reactions from the audience. A young boy clutched his mother's hand, his eyes wide with wonder. An older man nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes. The judge watched intently, a faint smile playing on his lips. She felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, pride, and gratitude. She realized that she was not alone on the stage. The music connected her to every person in the room, bridging gaps of experience, background, and expectation. When the final note faded, the hall was silent for a heartbeat, and then applause erupted. It started slowly, then grew louder, more insistent, more genuine. The nurse sat there, chest heaving, overwhelmed by the response. She had faced her fears, shared her story, and touched the hearts of strangers with nothing but a piano and her honesty. She realized that the true reward was not in recognition prizes or accolades. It was in the act of giving a piece of herself to the world, of daring to be seen, and of trusting that people would listen. After the recital, people approached her, some with questions, others with compliments, and some simply to shake her hand. She responded with humility, gratitude, and a quiet sense of accomplishment. She realized that her life had changed in ways she could not yet fully understand. The recital had not made her wealthy, famous, or powerful, but it had affirmed something far more important, that she had the courage, talent, and spirit to face challenges, to pursue her passions, and to connect with others in profound ways. As she returned home that night, the city lights shimmering in the distance, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Life had been difficult, often harsh, and full of obstacles, but it had also been filled with moments of beauty, kindness, and unexpected opportunity. She understood that the music had not changed her circumstances, but it had changed her perspective, strengthened her spirit, and reminded her that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Her brother noticed the change in her too. He saw her walking with a lighter step, heard her humming softly as she prepared meals, and sensed a newfound peace in her presence. He asked her quietly, "Will you play again?" She smiled, her eyes shining. "I will," she said softly, "because now I know I can." In the following days, the nurse returned to her routine with renewed energy. She cared for her patients with the same dedication as before. But now she carried an invisible spark, a reminder of her courage and the power of music. She practiced whenever she could, sometimes in the quiet of the hospital during breaks, sometimes late at night in her small apartment. Each session strengthened her hands, her confidence, and her connection to the music that had become a lifeline, a voice, and a bridge to others. Word of her recital slowly spread through the community. Volunteers, patients, and hospital staff spoke of the nurse who had amazed everyone with her performance. The woman who had turned an ordinary event into something extraordinary. Some were inspired to pursue their own hidden passions. Others were reminded of the quiet talents of people they often overlooked. Her story became a ripple, touching lives in subtle but meaningful ways. And yet, despite the recognition and the applause, the nurse remained humble. She knew that her journey was far from over, that life would continue to test her. The challenges would arise and that obstacles would appear. But she also knew that she had discovered something invaluable, a courage that could not be taken away, a voice that could reach others, and a spirit that refused to be broken. One evening, as she sat by the window, gazing at the city lights, she allowed herself to dream. She imagined performing for larger audiences, teaching music to children who could not afford lessons, and sharing her story with others who felt invisible or overlooked. She realized that her life was no longer defined solely by hardship and duty, but also by creativity, connection, and the courage to embrace opportunities when they appeared. In that quiet moment, the nurse understood that the piano test she had faced was more than a challenge, it was a turning point. It had revealed her strength, her resilience, and her capacity to inspire others. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, she knew that she would never face it alone. The music, the courage, and the love she carried within her would guide her, sustain her, and connect her to the world in ways she had never imagined. The days after the recital were a blur of emotions. On the one hand, the nurse felt a quiet pride that had been absent for years. She had stepped into a space that felt completely alien and had emerged not broken, but stronger, with her dignity intact. Yet, on the other hand, there was a lingering sense of vulnerability. She knew that the world could be cruel, that admiration often came with scrutiny, and that not everyone would be kind or understanding. She could feel it in the small glances from strangers, the whispers of curiosity, and even the subtle tension in the hospital hallways where people had begun to ask questions about her music. One morning, as she arrived for her shift, she noticed a few familiar faces from the recital standing outside the hospital. A local reporter had come, camera in hand, hoping to capture the story of the nurse who had astonished everyone with her piano playing. He smiled politely and asked if he could speak to her. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready for more attention. Her life had always been private, small, and quiet. She had never sought recognition. But something inside her stirred a mix of courage and curiosity, and she agreed. The interview was brief but meaningful. The reporter asked her about her life, her work, and the recital. She spoke honestly, describing long nights at the hospital, the small apartment she shared with her brother, and the moments she had stolen to play the piano when the world was asleep. She did not embellish, she did not boast. She simply told her story. And as she spoke, she felt a strange sense of liberation, as though telling her story aloud made it more real, more tangible, and more powerful. Soon, the article appeared in the local newspaper. Her photograph, showing her in her worn uniform and a soft, genuine smile, accompanied the story. She felt a mixture of pride and nervousness as she read the words. The story praised her courage, her talent, and her dedication, but it also humanized her, reminding readers that greatness could come from ordinary places, from people who worked tirelessly and quietly. Unseen by the world, the response was immediate. Letters, messages, and small gifts began to arrive. People offered words of encouragement, invitations to play at small community events, and even offers to provide piano lessons or lend instruments. Some came from children who had been inspired by her story, others from adults who saw a reflection of their own struggles in her journey. The nurse was overwhelmed, unsure of how to respond to such attention, yet deeply touched. She realized that her music was not just a private escape, it had the power to connect, inspire, and heal. Despite the growing attention, the nurse remained grounded. She continued her work at the hospital, tending to patients with the same care, patience, and dedication as always. She knew that her responsibilities did not change because of recognition, and she valued the stability and purpose her work gave her. Yet, the piano became a central part of her life. She practiced daily, experimenting with new pieces, exploring different styles, and allowing herself to feel the music deeply, not just mechanically. Each session strengthened not only her skill, but also her confidence and sense of self. One day, a representative from a music academy approached her. They had heard of her recital and wanted to offer her a place in an upcoming advanced piano program. The nurse was stunned. She had never considered formal training beyond the limited practice she had managed in secret. The offer felt like an impossible dream, a door opening that she had not dared to knock on. She hesitated, thinking of her brother, her work, and the many responsibilities that weighed on her. Could she leave behind her routines, her patience, and her small but stable life to pursue something so uncertain? That night, she sat by her window, staring at the city lights, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the piano keys she had set nearby. She thought of all the moments that had brought her here, the long nights at the hospital, the years of quiet practice, the small victories, and the challenges she had overcome. She thought of the people who had believed in her, even when she had doubted herself, and she realized that opportunities like this did not come often. Courage, she decided, was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. The next morning, she made her decision. She would accept the invitation to the music program, balancing it carefully with her work at the hospital. It would be difficult, exhausting even, but she felt ready. She understood that growth often came with discomfort, and that true fulfillment required stepping beyond the boundaries of safety and routine. She informed the academy, who welcomed her warmly, and returned to her patients with a renewed sense of purpose. As the weeks went by, she began attending classes at the academy during her days off and late evenings. The environment was intimidating at first. Many of the students came from privileged backgrounds, with formal training, expensive instruments, and years of practice. She felt out of place, acutely aware of her worn hands and modest clothing. But she reminded herself that her journey was different, shaped by struggle and perseverance, and that her music had a unique voice that no one else could replicate. She immersed herself in the lessons, absorbing every detail, practicing relentlessly, and learning to embrace both criticism and guidance with humility. Meanwhile, her reputation continued to grow. The hospital staff began to view her differently, not with skepticism, but with admiration. Patients spoke of her with pride, friends and neighbors looked up to her, and the small community around her began to see the nurse not just as a caregiver, but as someone who had achieved something remarkable through talent, courage, and persistence. The recognition was flattering, but it also brought pressure. She felt the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders, the subtle fear of failure, and the constant reminder that she could not allow herself to falter. One evening, after an especially long day at the hospital and a demanding practice session, she sat alone in her apartment, exhausted in every sense of the word. Doubts crept in. What if she failed at the academy? What if she could not keep up with the students who had more resources and experience? What if her music, despite all her efforts, was not enough to make an impact? She stared at the piano, silent and waiting, and let her thoughts tumble in a chaotic swirl of fear and uncertainty. Then, she remembered the moment on stage, the first recital, when she had faced an audience of strangers and played from her heart. She remembered the way the music had connected her to others, the soft applause, the faces softened by surprise and admiration. She remembered the warmth, the quiet acknowledgement, and the courage that had carried her through. And she realized something profound. The music was not about perfection, wealth, or recognition. It was about honesty, about sharing a piece of herself, about daring to show the world who she was, no matter the outcome. With that thought, she lifted her hands to the keys. She played softly at first, letting the familiar notes guide her, then with more confidence, allowing the music to fill the room. To carry away the doubts and fears that had plagued her, she played not to impress, not to achieve, but to express, to release, and to remind herself of the strength she carried within. The sound resonated through the small apartment, each note a declaration of resilience, courage, and the quiet power of a life lived with honesty and dedication. In the days that followed, the nurse found a rhythm, balancing her work, her practice, and her personal life with growing skill. She discovered that discipline was not just about hours spent, but about intention, focus, and the willingness to persevere through exhaustion and doubt. She also discovered a community of supportive peers and mentors at the academy. People who encouraged her, challenged her, and celebrated her progress. Their guidance helped her refine her technique, expand her repertoire, and deepen her understanding of music as a language of emotion and human connection. As she grew more confident in her abilities, invitations to perform began to arrive. Small recitals, community events, and charity gatherings asked for her presence. Each opportunity was a test, a chance to face public scrutiny again, and each time she played, she felt the familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration. But she also felt the growing assurance that her music had power not just to entertain, but to inspire, heal, and connect. She realized that every note, every chord, and every melody was a bridge between her world and the world of others. Her brother watched these changes with quiet pride. He saw her dedication, the way she carried herself with renewed confidence, and the joy that music brought to her life. One evening, as they sat together, eating a simple meal, he said, "I'm proud of you. I always knew you had something special," she smiled. A mixture of gratitude and humility in her expression, realizing that her journey was not just her own, but intertwined with the people who loved and supported her along the way.